All right, hello, future teachers. Here are some quick reviews over the things that you were asked to read. I hope you get a chance to read all of them. And just to help you recap what you're reading or to help you process, here are some quick notes. So if you go to chapter 7 in your How to Plan Differentiated Reading Instruction, that's the Warple McKenna book, you're going to talk about target vocabulary and comprehension. And you're going to hear about some things. You're going to hear about unconstrained versus constrained skills. So constrained skills are like decoding and things that at some point you should be able to say, oh, they're proficient. Whereas unconstrained skills are things that like vocabulary and comprehension where there's no real ceiling to it because you constantly learn new words. You constantly are able to comprehend new concepts and more challenging texts. And that's just kind of measured with growth. So if you go back to your staircase, and I encourage you to do that, and you look at the different levels where children build with their understanding, one of the top levels, it says if we start there, and let's say, for example, a child is very fluent in their reading, and then some people assume that, okay, well, small groups aren't really for them because they're already fluent. Do fluent readers need vocabulary and comprehension, work with small groups? And the answer pretty much in chapter 7 is very much so. And it's basically they're saying that some people will argue that that's not necessary. They give their reasons why they stand against that argument. And they explain that when you differentiate reading, it serves all children, irregardless. It talks about the most, here's what it says, if the most recent fluency benchmark has been met, the child belongs in a vocabulary and comprehension group, and it'll be really useful for them. It talks about vocabulary and comprehension proficiency is very different among students, and that's why it's powerful for them to engage in these reading small groups. So then it talks about, okay, well then what's some of the research? Basically, the research confirms that working in small groups, one of the strategies that's most beneficial is drawing inferences or inferring. This provides the readers with an ability to focus their thinking at key points and unpack what they're thinking. And it also talked about text structures, that as they're reading different types of text, they're able to identify the different text structures in the midst of their reading to enhance their vocabulary and comprehension. So when they did the research on vocabulary, 3 things stood out. 1, teachers should teach words that are useful for comprehending academic text across areas. You should also teach words that children don't already know, but they need to learn while they're in school. And then you need to teach words that are related to each other so that they connect and foster a deep or depth of knowledge. So one of the key words you can remember if we're talking about a talking point for chapter 7 is the need to explicitly teach vocabulary. It's not something that they're just going to pick up because the words are in the book and they're just going to read them in context and then just naturally assume what they mean properly. It says that no, you need to do an extensive review, and it's not going to be incidental exposure. Important words need to be taught. Thus, the importance of having those community charts, or some people call them anchor charts, where those words that are content related, especially in nonfiction text, are used and shared, but it's explicit instruction. And then those words need to be reviewed, like most things, for the retention of words. And they call that the principle of distributed review. And the same thing we do as we're learners, as adults. The more you review what you learn, the more it aids to going into your long-term memory. So pretty much they just express that the goal is to have a varied challenge, which means you want to vary the type of text, narrative, expository. I know Common Core made a greater push for more informational text to be read, not so much narrative text or nonfiction. And then you want to slowly advance the text. And that's what makes these small groups so powerful, because the students can move. It talked about that span should last. You should reassess for fluency at the mid-year. And then it's not like you're moving them out of groups when you're done with the book and then you switch to all the groups or you do a whole new assessment. But it's saying you get a good quality trade book. You decide on the focus that connects the books. And then as you are teaching, you do your assessments for fluency. They did note, though, that if a child during that mid-year check has slid back, that they may have to be placed in a fluency group as opposed to just being in the vocabulary and comprehension group. And that when you're selecting books, you can look at the lexile levels of the books, how it appeals to the students, and other considerations like that. Something that for me as a talking point, I was like, when it mentioned on page 247, that the average of 12 exposures to a word over time in different contexts are needed to gain adequate knowledge of the actual meaning of the word. So 12 different exposures in different contexts for students to really be able to solidify what a word means or the multiple meanings of a word or how to use the word. So then they talk about good ways to teach comprehension. Literally, they go right back to inferencing and text structure being really important for vocabulary and comprehension. They also talk about using a format of before, during, and after. So before is like 3 to 4 minutes. You introduce the book, you describe the text feature, and you give the students a focus for reading. During is when the children are actually doing the reading and the teacher can monitor during this time. And then after, you review the focus, you go over vocabulary, probably tier 2 words, and then you ask those inferential questions to get the children to draw inferences. And so that is a quick review of some of the things you might find in chapter 7. In summary of chapter 7, it just basically says that targeted instruction during small group time is essential, and that small groups aren't just for struggling students, they're also for students who are at the higher end of that staircase where they can work on vocabulary and comprehension to aid their background knowledge. All right, so if we're talking about background knowledge and comprehension, you might want to jump to that article. And the article is called Rethinking How to Promote Reading Comprehension. It's an excellent article. If you can, please make time to read it. Some of the biggest takeaways from that is sometimes people think of comprehension as like a part of reading, and sometimes it's like, oh, there's comprehension skills. And we just talked about, can you infer? Can you analyze? Can you visualize? Can you evaluate? And we think of it as skills or strategies, as opposed to just, in order for them to comprehend, comprehension is a lot of things put together. So comprehension is just gaining that knowledge. It's having background knowledge. It's activating that background knowledge. It's adding new knowledge to that. And so the visual I have is, okay, so imagine a closet and there's a rack or there's a pole in the closet. And so in order for you to put things on that rack, what do you need? You need a hanger. So if you're going to hang up a shirt in your closet, but there was nowhere to place the shirt and you just took the shirt and put it in there, it would drop to the floor and you'd have a floor full of clothes. It'd be a hot mess. You wouldn't know what to find. You would not have any sense of organization. It'd just be a mess. However, the purpose of a hanger is for you to attach the clothing to the hanger to attach it to the pole. Think of the pole as like your prior knowledge, and that hanger is something, or your brain, and the hanger is allowing you to have something to connect it to. Think of the shirt as the new knowledge students acquire. And if they can take that new knowledge and hook it to the hanger, they have something that allows it to connect with the pole. And then you have some sense of organization, a place to put it. So a lot of times when students get new information, if they don't have something to connect it to, it's difficult for them to know where to put it. So they give this example of a story where they're giving these vague directions, and they showed how most of the adult class couldn't understand what to do. They were highly confused. But at the end, when they told them, oh, by the way, these were the directions to help you wash clothes, it was like, oh, now it makes sense. The directions make sense when it was explained what the whole point was or the topic. They had something to hang it or attach it to, because that way, when you were listening to the directions, you were visualizing, oh yeah, I've washed clothes before, or I've watched other people wash clothes, or you had all of these other vocabulary words, softener, detergent, wash cycles that popped in your head that weren't in the directions. But once you knew what they were talking about, you could attach your previous knowledge. And it's just saying that when we think of comprehension, we have to think of it like that. It said the importance of comprehension is it keeps us from going down blind alleys when we have something to anchor the information to. And I'm gonna give a quick example. I used to teach 3rd and 4th grade, and there's one thing we would do, like before we read a book, if I could find a movie, I showed the movie first. And people were like, that's lame. You should show the movie afterwards. And I'm like, no, I have students who struggle to picture some of these concepts. They don't have prior knowledge. My students don't, there's certain things I know they're going to encounter in this book, and they're going to need to see it and just to even have a reference point. So when they read this word, they at least have a picture that pops up in their head. And the book was Because of Winn-Dixie. But there were certain things I needed them to see. So we watched the book first. And then as we were reading the book and going through it and posing questions And because the book wasn't exactly like the movie. So yes, it does kind of throw off predictions, but in terms of them being able to infer a little bit more deeply, they were able to do it because they go back and like, oh, was that like the scene in the library where, she was, afraid and she such and such assumed that the dog was a bear. Well, now they can unpack the word assumed a lot more because they remember her seeing the dog and being afraid and really believing that it was a bear. So it helped them to unpack that vocabulary and then to comprehend why she might have thought that because they remember in a previous story, she was scared of something. Needless to say, it helps give you a lot of context. So, for example, reading a book about camping is going to be completely foreign to a child who has no clue. What do you mean camp? I remember I read a story to my son, and in the story, the little boy had a friend who was smoking, and his mom said, "You can't be around him because he smokes. It's dangerous." And so, literally, this was my son, and my son was like, "Oh, mom, I get it." And he was like, the boy was so upset that it was like, in the cartoons when like their head pops and like the smoke comes out, but they're really, his mom didn't want him hanging around the other boy because the boy had a lot of anger that was like showing. And because he had no concept of what does it mean for a person to smoke? They're not literally on fire, but he had never heard, he didn't know what cigarettes were. So for him, it's just like, what do you mean smoke? He couldn't make that connection to the story. So what he pictured was very, very different. And so we're talking about how his prior knowledge limited his ability to comprehend in that text the multiple meaning of the word smoking, whether it be figurative or literal, and the different way things that word can mean. So pretty much I encourage you, please read that article. It was super powerful, but it talked about the need right now to be able to make sure that students, that comprehension is taught on a wider scope and that we don't ignore the importance of prior knowledge and allowing students to build knowledge, and how sometimes when it comes to the assessment of that can fall super short. All right, so that's two of the resources thus far. The other article that you were asked to read, which was also really good, was Maximizing the Effectiveness of a Read Aloud. I am a super big fan of read alouds, and basically it told you about many of the positive effects of read aloud. It did give you some research to show that they didn't always have like stunning results, but it showed you there are some things that are totally positive about having a read aloud. It encourages children to use their background knowledge. It helps children when the teacher's reading, you can read in an engaging way to attract them and engage the students. You can help confirm their predictions. Just it really brings the students into the book, but then it helps to walk them through the book. And they just said, be careful. If you're going to read aloud, really make a wise choice. What is the benefit to reading the text aloud versus having the children read it on their own? What do you gain? What do you lose? So it's like the pros and cons of it. What's the goal and how does it align with your curriculum? So if you're just reading for the sake of reading because you're trying to help them fall asleep because they're being weird, maybe not the best reason to do a read aloud. But if you're trying to model maybe expression, or if there's something, if it's a higher level book and you really want them to understand this concept or this principle you're really teaching about in your curriculum, tolerance or something like that, and it's a big concept, but you're using a picture book to help convey that so that you can probe deeper into the questions. They're just saying know why you're doing what you're doing, and how read alouds assist with being able to sometimes have that deep learning of words to be able to focus on the lesson. And then they give a layout on some ways that you can do that for even parents when they're doing a read aloud, some things that they can just talk to their students to make their read alouds more engaging and more targeted. So last but not least, you were asked to listen to something kind of like you're doing now. And I do encourage you to take the time to listen to that. What the author is going to talk about is three main things that help comprehension instruction. She's going to talk about picture walks, directed reading thinking activities, and KWLs. And what you're going to find is that she thought it was very interesting that out of all three, directed reading thinking activities actually yielded the best results because students were predicting what the book was going to be about. They would read a little bit, they would stop, they would talk about it, they would unpack things, they'd ask questions, and then they'd read a little more and they'd ask more questions and they'd unpack a little bit more and then they'd read a little more. And it was like this directed and reading and stopping and scaffolding and thinking and integrating their prior knowledge. And it showed that even though all three were equally good at developing vocabulary, it was the direct reading thinking activities that yielded the best overall results over time when it came to them retaining information and acquiring information. And her advice was when you're working with like science and social studies and informational text, to talk about it the same way we talk about narrative text, to really stop and pause and break it down and scaffold that information. And that's that. So I hope this was helpful today. I hope it didn't go too long, but this was everything you were asked to read this week. So as you're posting your talking points, I do want to remind you, please turn those in before class, not necessarily during class, because then sometimes it can show up as late, and we don't want that to happen. All right, future teachers, have a wonderful day, and thank you for your time.